The U-60 Blackhawk sat motionless on the tarmac at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, its rotors drooping like the wings of a defeated bird. For 3 days, the multi-million-dollar aircraft had been nothing more than an expensive paperweight, despite the frantic efforts of the base's most skilled mechanics and technicians. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she climbed down from the cockpit, her third unsuccessful attempt to start the helicopter that morning. The August sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt, creating shimmering heat waves that distorted the view of the hangar where a crowd of frustrated personnel had gathered. "Still nothing," she called out to Master Sergeant James Patterson, who stood with his arms crossed, studying a tablet filled with diagnostic reports. "All systems check out green, fuel pressures normal, batteries fully charged. It should be running like a dream, but she won't even turn over." Before continuing, give this story a like and subscribe to discover more tales of unsung heroes whose true value often goes unnoticed until the moment it matters most. The Blackhawk was scheduled for a critical medical evacuation training exercise that afternoon, one that had been postponed twice already. Colonel Sarah Mitchell had made it clear that further delays were unacceptable. The base's reputation was on the line, and with inspection teams arriving the following week, every piece of equipment needed to be operational. Patterson shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. "I've had our best people on this. We've run every diagnostic in the book, replaced components that were working fine, and even brought in specialists from the depot. Nothing makes sense." Nearby, a small group of younger mechanics exchanged theories and suggestions, their voices filled with the confidence that comes from technical training and modern troubleshooting methods. They spoke of computer diagnostics, sensor malfunctions, and complex electrical issues that might require specialized equipment to resolve. Among them stood Technical Sergeant Kevin Murphy, recently transferred from a civilian aviation company where he'd worked on cutting-edge helicopter systems. "I'm telling you, it's got to be in the flight control computer," he insisted, tapping his tablet. "These older models are notorious for intermittent failures that don't show up on standard diagnostics." But across the hangar, largely ignored by the bustling activity, sat an older man in faded fatigues. Chief Warrant Officer Robert "Bobby" Harrison had been at Fort Campbell for over 25 years, his weathered hands bearing the scars of countless hours working on aircraft that predated most of the technology the younger mechanics relied on. At 62, he was just months away from retirement, and lately he'd found himself increasingly sidelined as the military embraced newer diagnostic methods and computer-based troubleshooting. Harrison watched the proceedings with quiet interest, occasionally glancing at the silent helicopter. He'd flown and maintained Blackhawks since they first entered service, back when mechanics relied on experience, instinct, and the subtle sounds and vibrations that told the story of an aircraft's condition. He'd seen this exact scenario before, though it had been years ago, and the solution had been surprisingly simple. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd around the helicopter grew larger, Harrison remained in his corner, methodically organizing his toolbox. Several times, he considered approaching the group to offer his perspective, but each time he hesitated. The younger mechanics seemed so confident in their modern approaches, and he'd grown accustomed to being overlooked in favor of computer diagnostics and technical manuals. The sun began to set over Fort Campbell, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The Blackhawk remained silent, its mystery unsolved, despite the collective efforts of the base's most qualified personnel. Tomorrow would bring another day of troubleshooting, more pressure from command, and the growing possibility that the aircraft might need to be grounded indefinitely pending a complete overhaul. But sometimes, the most valuable solutions come from the voices we've stopped listening to. The morning of the fourth day arrived with the same oppressive Kentucky heat, but the atmosphere around the grounded Blackhawk had grown noticeably tenser. Word had spread throughout Fort Campbell that the inspection team would be arriving earlier than expected, and Colonel Mitchell's patience had worn thin. Chief Warrant Officer Harrison arrived at the hangar before dawn, as was his habit. The quiet hours before the base came alive had always been his favorite time to work, when he could think clearly without the noise and urgency that seemed to define modern military maintenance operations. As he sipped his coffee from a thermos that had seen better days, Harrison watched the sunrise paint the helicopter in shades of gold and amber. He'd spent the previous evening thinking about the problem, running through possibilities in his mind the way he'd learned to do during his early years as a crew chief. Back then, diagnostic equipment was limited, and mechanics had to develop an almost intuitive understanding of their aircraft. The first wave of personnel began arriving around 700, led by Master Sergeant Patterson and the team of specialists who'd been working on the helicopter. Their faces showed the strain of 3 days of unsuccessful troubleshooting, and Harrison could see the doubt beginning to creep into their confidence. "All right, people," Patterson announced to the assembled group. "We're going to start from scratch today. I want every connection checked, every component tested, and every manual consulted. There has to be something we're missing." Technical Sergeant Murphy stepped forward, his tablet already loaded with new diagnostic protocols he'd downloaded overnight. "I've been researching similar cases online, and there are several documented instances of intermittent failures in the engine control unit that only manifest under specific conditions." Harrison set down his coffee and quietly approached the group, his movement barely noticed among the bustle of activity. He'd made a decision during the night, regardless of whether anyone wanted to hear it. He had an obligation to share what he suspected might be the problem. "Excuse me, Master Sergeant," Harrison said softly, his voice barely audible above the conversations around them. Patterson looked up from his tablet, surprised to see the older warrant officer. "Morning, Bob. Don't worry about this one, we've got it covered. Why don't you focus on the maintenance schedules for next week?" Harrison nodded politely, but didn't move away. "I understand, Sergeant, but I think I might know what's wrong with her." He gestured toward the Blackhawk with a weathered hand that trembled slightly, whether from age or nervousness, it was hard to tell. Murphy laughed, not unkindly, but with the confidence of someone who'd grown up with digital diagnostics. "No offense, Chief, but if our computer systems can't find the problem, I doubt it's something you can spot just by looking at it." Several of the younger mechanics nodded in agreement, their faith in technology absolute. They'd been trained to trust data over intuition, to rely on sensors and computers rather than the inexact science of experience and observation. Harrison felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but something deeper drove him to persist. "I've seen this before," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Back in '98, we had a bird with the exact same symptoms. Wouldn't start for days, all diagnostics came back clean, everyone was stumped." Patterson glanced at his watch, clearly anxious to get the troubleshooting underway. "Bob, I appreciate your experience, I really do. But we're under a lot of pressure here, and we need to use every available resource and the most current methods." "What was it?" Staff Sergeant Rodriguez asked suddenly, stepping away from the helicopter where she'd been conducting her own inspection. "In '98, what was the problem?" Harrison looked at her gratefully, surprised that someone had shown interest in his story. "Fuel contamination," he said simply, "not the kind that shows up in standard tests, but water condensation that had settled in a specific part of the fuel system. The sensors couldn't detect it because it wasn't mixing with the fuel. It was just sitting there, blocking flow at a critical junction." Murphy shook his head dismissively. "We've tested the fuel extensively. It's clean." "Have you checked the fuel manifold drain valve?" Harrison asked quietly. The question hung in the air for a moment, and Harrison could see the uncertainty flicker across several faces. It was an old-school check, something that predated computerized fuel system diagnostics, and not something that would typically be included in modern troubleshooting protocols. Patterson frowned. "The what?" "The fuel manifold drain valve, a small, seemingly insignificant component tucked away in the bowels of the Blackhawk's fuel system. Most of the younger mechanics had never heard of it, despite its presence in technical manuals that few bothered to read beyond the computer-generated maintenance schedules. Chief Warrant Officer Harrison could see the confusion on their faces, and for a moment he felt the weight of his years in a way that was both humbling and empowering. These were good people, skilled in their own right, but they'd been trained in an era where computers handled the thinking and mechanics followed digital instructions. The fuel manifold drain valve, Harrison repeated, moving closer to the Blackhawk. It's a manual drain point installed in the fuel system to remove water and sediment. Most people forget it exists because modern fuel quality is generally excellent, and the automatic systems usually handle contamination. Technical Sergeant Murphy pulled out his tablet, scrolling through technical diagrams. I don't see it listed in any of the standard diagnostic procedures. That's because it predates most of those procedures, Harrison explained patiently. When these birds were first designed, fuel contamination was a bigger concern. The valve was installed as a backup system, something you could use when the automated systems weren't catching everything. Master Sergeant Patterson looked skeptical but intrigued. 3 days of failed troubleshooting had made him more open to unconventional approaches. Even if you're right, Bob, why would that prevent startup? The fuel system shows normal pressure and flow rates. Harrison knelt beside the helicopter, his practiced hands already reaching for the access panel. Because the valve isn't just a drain, it's also a potential obstruction point. If water settles there and freezes, or if debris accumulates, it can create a partial blockage that's just enough to prevent proper fuel flow during startup, but not enough to trigger the pressure sensors. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez joined him at the access panel, genuinely curious now. But wouldn't that show up as a fuel pressure anomaly? Not necessarily, Harrison replied, working to remove the panel with tools that seemed to move in his hands with practiced efficiency. The blockage might only affect flow under the specific pressure and volume conditions of startup. Once the engines are running and the fuel pumps are at full operation, there might be enough force to push past the obstruction. The group gathered around as Harrison exposed the fuel system components, his weathered hands navigating the maze of lines and connections with the confidence of someone who'd performed this operation countless times. The younger mechanics watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, their tablets and diagnostic equipment suddenly seeming less relevant. There, Harrison said, pointing to a small valve assembly that was barely visible among the larger components. The fuel manifold drain valve. See how it's positioned at the low point of this section? That's intentional gravity pulls contaminants down to this spot. Murphy leaned in closer, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine interest. How long has that been there? Since day one, Harrison replied. But maintenance protocols changed about 15 years ago. Computer diagnostics became the standard, and manual checks like this one got moved to annual inspections instead of routine troubleshooting. Patterson pulled out his own tablet, scrolling through the maintenance history. According to this, the last time anyone checked that valve was 8 months ago during the scheduled annual. Harrison nodded knowingly. And in 8 months, especially with the humidity we've had this summer, it's entirely possible for condensation to accumulate. The automated fuel quality sensors test the main tank contents, but they don't specifically monitor this drain point. With practiced movements, Harrison began disconnecting the valve assembly, his tools seeming to know exactly which fasteners to target. Clear fluid began to drip from the disconnected line fuel, as expected, but as Harrison manipulated the valve, something else became visible. "Well, I'll be damned," Rodriguez whispered, staring at the small amount of water that had separated from the fuel and collected in the valve housing. The water wasn't much, perhaps a few ounces, but it was positioned perfectly to disrupt fuel flow during the critical startup sequence. Harrison held up the valve assembly, showing the small chamber where the contamination had accumulated. "It's not enough to trigger alarms," he explained, "but it's just enough to prevent the fuel from flowing properly when the engine tries to start. The fuel pumps can't build enough initial pressure to push past the water barrier, so the engine never gets the fuel it needs for ignition. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of base activity and the soft dripping of fuel being cleaned from the valve assembly. Murphy shook his head in amazement. 3 days of diagnostics, and it was something this simple. The repair itself took less than 10 minutes, a stark contrast to the 3 days of complex troubleshooting that had preceded it. Chief Warrant Officer Harrison cleaned the fuel manifold drain valve with the methodical precision of someone who'd performed the task hundreds of times, while the assembled mechanics watched in respectful silence. The key, Harrison explained as he worked, is making sure you get all the water out, not just from the valve, but from the entire low section of the fuel line. Water's heavier than fuel, so it settles in the lowest points of the system. Technical Sergeant Murphy documented the process on his tablet, occasionally asking questions about the procedure. His earlier skepticism had been completely replaced by genuine curiosity and what appeared to be embarrassment at having overlooked such a fundamental check. Why isn't this in the standard troubleshooting protocol anymore? Staff Sergeant Rodriguez asked, helping Harrison reconnect the fuel lines. Harrison paused in his work, considering the question carefully. Progress, he said simply. Computer diagnostics can catch 99% of problems faster and more accurately than manual checks. It makes sense to rely on them first. But that remaining 1%, the old problems, the simple problems, the problems that predate modern sensors, those still require the old ways of thinking. Master Sergeant Patterson watched the repair with mixed emotions. As a maintenance supervisor, he was relieved that the problem was finally solved, but he also felt troubled by how easily his team had dismissed the experience and knowledge of their senior personnel. How many other obsolete procedures might we be overlooking? He asked, more to himself than to anyone else. Harrison finished securing the last connection and stood up, his knees protesting the movement in a way that reminded everyone of his age. Probably more than we'd like to admit, he said honestly, but that's not necessarily anyone's fault. Technology has made us incredibly efficient and accurate. The problem comes when we stop remembering that technology is a tool, not a replacement for understanding. The moment of truth had arrived. Harrison moved to the pilot's seat while Rodriguez took the co-pilot position, their hands moving through the pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency. The other mechanics gathered around the helicopter, some holding their breath, others checking their tablets one final time as if the diagnostic equipment might suddenly reveal what they had missed. Fuel pressure, Harrison called out. Normal, Rodriguez responded, her voice steady despite the tension everyone felt. Battery. Fully charged. Control systems. All greens. Harrison's weathered hand moved to the engine start switch, and for a moment, the entire hangar seemed to hold its breath. 3 days of failure weighed heavily in the air, along with the collective doubt that had built up among the maintenance team. The switch engaged with a soft click, and immediately the familiar whine of the turbine engine beginning to spool up filled the hangar. The sound was sweet music to everyone present, but especially to Harrison, who had spent decades listening to the subtle variations that told the story of an aircraft's health. The engine caught and held, its pitch rising steadily as the turbine reached operating speed. The rotor blades began their slow rotation, gradually building momentum until the distinctive whop-whop-whop of a healthy Blackhawk filled the air. Cheers erupted from the assembled mechanics, a mixture of relief, amazement, and perhaps a touch of chagrin at how long it had taken them to solve what was ultimately a simple problem. Rodriguez turned to Harrison with a smile that was part gratitude and part admiration. "Chief, that was incredible. How did you know?" Harrison smiled back, but his expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Experience," he said simply, "but more than that, I remembered that sometimes the newest technology can't see the oldest problems." As the Blackhawk settled into a steady idle, Patterson approached the cockpit, his face showing a mixture of emotions. "Bob, I owe you an apology. We all do. We should have listened to you from the beginning." Harrison shook his head gently. "No apology necessary, James. You were doing what you were trained to do. But maybe this is a good reminder that experience and technology work best when they work together." The successful startup was just the beginning, but it represented something more significant than a repaired helicopter. 1 month later, Fort Campbell's maintenance protocols had undergone a quiet but significant transformation. The successful repair of the Blackhawk had sparked conversations throughout the base about the balance between technological advancement and institutional knowledge, leading to changes that would outlast any single assignment or deployment. Chief Warrant Officer Harrison found himself in an unexpected position. Instead of being relegated to paperwork and routine maintenance schedules during his final months of service, he had been asked to develop a comprehensive training program that integrated traditional troubleshooting methods with modern diagnostic procedures. The goal, Colonel Mitchell had explained during their meeting, is to make sure we don't lose critical knowledge when experienced personnel retire. We need to capture not just the procedures, but the thinking behind them. The program Harrison developed became known as the Bridging Experience Initiative, and it paired senior mechanics with junior personnel in a way that encouraged the sharing of both old and new approaches to problem solving. Technical Sergeant Murphy had volunteered to be the first participant, eager to learn the manual diagnostic techniques that his computer-based training had never covered. "It's humbling," Murphy admitted to Harrison one afternoon as they worked together on a routine maintenance inspection. "I realized I was so focused on what the computers were telling me that I stopped really looking at the aircraft itself." Harrison nodded, guiding Murphy's attention to subtle signs of wear and stress that wouldn't show up on diagnostic equipment for months or even years. "Computers are incredible tools," he said, "but they can only tell you what they're programmed to look for. Experience teaches you to notice the things that haven't been programmed yet." The Blackhawk incident had also caught the attention of other military installations, and Harrison found himself traveling to bases across the country to share his insights and help develop similar programs. What had started as a simple fuel system repair had become a catalyst for examining how the military preserved and transferred critical knowledge. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been promoted and was now leading her own maintenance team, but she made sure to include Harrison's story in every training session she conducted. "The most important lesson," she would tell new mechanics, "isn't about fuel manifold drain valves. It's about remembering that experience has value even in an age of advanced technology." The inspection that everyone had been so worried about went flawlessly. The Blackhawk performed perfectly during all demonstrations, and the inspection team commented favorably on the base's maintenance procedures and the obvious expertise of its personnel. But for those who had lived through the 3 days of troubleshooting, the real victory was deeper and more personal. Master Sergeant Patterson had instituted a new policy requiring that all complex troubleshooting efforts include input from the most experienced personnel available, regardless of their role in the standard chain of responsibility. It was a simple change, but one that acknowledged the value of institutional knowledge in solving problems that technology couldn't address. As Harrison's retirement date approached, he reflected on the unexpected turn his final months of service had taken. What could have been a quiet fade into obsolescence had instead become an opportunity to bridge two eras of military maintenance, one based on experience and intuition, the other on technology and data. The Blackhawk continued to fly perfectly, its fuel system unmarked by the drama it had caused. But for the people who had learned from the experience, the lessons would last far longer than any single aircraft or assignment. On Harrison's last day at Fort Campbell, the entire maintenance team gathered in the hangar where the Blackhawk sat, ready for another mission. Colonel Mitchell presented him with a commendation recognizing his contribution not just to solving a single